This is Dr. Carroll, and this video is a continuation on methods. So let's start by talking about arguments and parameters. Arguments are what we pass to the method when the method is called. Let's give some examples here. So we could have a call to the deposit method on the checking object and pass it 1,234 and 56 hundredths. So probably money is what we're talking about here. So here this value, 1,234, is the argument, is how we refer to it. And just to be clear here, we can have a variable and then pass the variable to a method, and then that variable is considered the argument. This also applies to a constructor. For example, here, creating a new vehicle object. And so now the two strings that we're passing to that constructor are the arguments to the constructor. So that's arguments, and that's when we're calling the method. Let's talk about parameters. So parameters is short for formal parameters. So parameters are defined in the method declaration. They are the variables used inside of the method, and their scope is limited to that method. Let's see some examples. So if we had a deposit method, and so now amount is the parameter here, and so when deposit is called, the value is copied into amount, and we can use that here in the method, the deposit method here, by that name. Let's see another example. If we had a constructor here for a vehicle, we know it's a constructor because there's no return type, then we have two parameters here. Make and model are the parameters, and we can use them accordingly inside of the constructor, not shown here. So that's parameters. Now let's talk about the syntax for defining a method. So first we have the access modifier, then we have the return value, the method name. We're always going to have set of parentheses. We may or may not have a parameter list, and then we're going to have our brackets, our curly braces, our braces, and the body of the method will then be defined as between the curly braces. So let's go through each of these parts. So the access modifier is going to be either not present, and so it's going to be the default value, or it's going to be public, or it's going to be private, or it's going to be protected, depending on what we're trying to accomplish with this method. The return value is either going to be void, or it's going to be a primitive data type or a non-primitive data type. And we use void to indicate that it doesn't return anything. The method name itself needs to follow the same sort of rules that we have for variables. So the same rules like no spaces, can't start with a number, those sort of things. And by convention, not rule, but convention, it's going to start with a verb, and it's going to be lowercase. It's also going to start with a lowercase letter. Okay, let's talk about, and it's optional. A method does not have to have parameters. It may have them, and it may not. Let's talk about different kinds of methods. So we have accessor methods and mutator methods. So let's first talk about accessor methods. And so these methods are used to access the private data members of a class. Members often have the name of something like get or print or display in their names to indicate what they're going to do, where get is usually followed by a get value, get name, get whatever that item is, typically corresponding with the instance data, to be able to retrieve it. Because the data is, if it's private, that means objects outside the class can't access it without going through something like an accessor method. And so that's why they exist, to be able to access the data that way. We also have mutator methods. So mutator methods mutate, they change or modify the private data members in the class. And you can often spot these by their name, not just by what they do. But so methods that have names like set something or update and then followed by something are often mutator methods because they're changing the private data members. Okay, let's walk through some example code here. Let's look at a vehicle class. Very simple, not even really documented. And so what we're looking for is accessor methods to begin with. So an accessor method is one that is making private data members available to classes outside. So they would be getMake, getModel, getYear. And notice they're very simple. They're just returning a copy of make or returning a copy of a model or year so that these can be private here. Now let's look at mutator methods. Mutator methods would be like setMake, setModel, setYear. We usually don't consider the constructor as a mutator, although it does function as one because it's initializing the data members, and so it's kind of in as a subclass as the mutator one. Let's also look at some driver code here. Also we have toString method. That's a special name we'll get into later when we talk about inheritance. But notice it's not changing any of the private data members. Here this is string concatenation, and so this could be an accessor as well. We're getting that information. All right, let's look at some driver code for this. You can pause it and take it all in, and I'm going to keep moving forward. So here we instantiate 3 cars, and then we have an object reference to a 4th one here. And here we are calling one of the accessor methods, the getYear, and using it to determine which car is newer. And then furthermore we're calling getMake here, also an accessor method. It's not changing anything about it, it's just allowing us to be able to use that information. Here we called the default constructor here for car 3, and so here we are setting that information with these calls, and so these are mutator methods. We're actually changing the make, the model, and the year for this instance for car 3. And then here we're calling toString on each of them to display their contents. And so here we can point out the example of, here we have 4 reference objects, and also want to point out the member access operator right here. So we have an object reference. We use the member access for saying, hey, I want to get at this member, in this case a method, and so we use the dot operator here to be able to do that. Let's find some arguments. So here's some arguments to a constructor. And here's some arguments to a mutator here. And then parameters. We only have one parameter here that's not used. That's args as parameters. So if we switch back to vehicles.java, we have lots of parameters in here. All of these are parameters. Here in this mutator, make is parameter, model, these are all parameters which we can use. Compilers don't enforce these rules that it has to be an accessor or mutator. Those are names that we apply to methods so that we can talk about them fluidly, okay? And so as a developer, accept these rules and follow them so that your code is easier to read, others can understand it better, and your coworkers will be able to say, oh, get, and they'll know exactly what's going on and as you follow these rules. And so now with accessors and mutators, the reason we have these is so that we can implement encapsulation, meaning that changing of the data of an object is controlled by the object's methods and not outside the object. So we've encapsulated that data inside the object, and we are very deliberate and uniform about how we access it and change it. And so we call that encapsulation. Let's talk about another type of method, helper methods. A helper method is one that is called by one or other methods in the same class. And so often they are dealing directly with the data instance variables, and so the implementation details. And so they should not be part of the interface because of that reason. So they're often declared private, but as you find you're having code in 2 or more places, or you have a method that's getting very long and you want to break it up and make it more readable, then this is where a helper method can come into play, and you just make it private. Some companies have naming conventions, for example, that they start each of the method's names with like an X underscore and then the name, so that some of these characteristics are readily obvious, but these are just conventions in place. And so if you had a bank account class, then something like calculate interest, calculate taxes, or does account appear inactive could all be private helper methods if they're not intended to be called by other classes, but just to internally take care of bookkeeping and to take care of things like that. Let's talk about names. So qualified names and simple names. And so a qualified name includes a couple parts. So we're either going to refer to the class name or an object reference, and then we're going to have the member access operator, the dot, and then we're going to have the member name. And typically we're dealing with method names when we're talking about qualified names, because we're outside of the scope of the class. And so we're referencing, in this class I want to do this, and that's most appropriate to be calling a method instead of actually accessing the data instances, because they're usually private. And so that's a full qualified name. So some examples could be when we call, for example, math.square-root. Here, since this is a static method, we specify the class name and then the method name, and then we're taking the square root of 4.313. And another example is our reoccurring model, a checking.deposit. We're passing it something. So checking here isn't the name of a class, but is an object reference. It's an instantiation of the class. So we say, hey, on this instance of my class, of my bank account object, which I'm going to refer to as checking, I want to call the deposit method and passing it that value. And so that's a qualified name. Now these are in contrast to simple names. So simple name is what you can use when you're within the same class. You can just refer to it by just the name of the variable or the name of the method, either one. And so that's the simple name. Let's see some examples. So if you had a simple bank account class with a balance as your instance data, and then you had your constructor, then you can refer to balance just by its simple name because it's a member of the class. And by the way, you can't refer to balance as a qualified name outside this class because it is declared private. Let's see another example. So if we had an initialize account here, which we could make either public or we could make private, and then we could call initialize account maybe in the constructor here. And so again, we can use the simple name here to initialize the account. And so just to illustrate, we can do that with data members or method members as well. And that's a simple name there. So there's an analogy that I think fits very well here, and that's with names. And so within your own family, you're going to refer to people as their first name. That's ambiguous. except in the case of like George Foreman, where he named like all 6 of his kids George. That's a side issue. Usually names are unambiguous and you can refer to people by their first name. Whereas if you're talking about somebody outside of your family, you often, at least initially, refer to them by their full name. You could consider that like a qualified name. And so we're along the same lines of you're saying, well, this class and then this member, it's actually reversed, at least in English, where you have the last name and the first name, but you get the point. So you can use short names if you're familiar with it, if you're within the same family. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it.